Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to look at how Egypt responded to the fragmentation and regionalization that arose during the First Intermediate Period. Now, unlike the Roman Empire that split up totally for good once it started to break apart, Egypt was able to re-centralize power in the hands of powerful pharaohs that would reassert their authority over the Nile River Valley, the Delta, and once again send expeditions abroad. In doing so, the Middle Kingdom became a period of flourishing, especially for art and literature. So, if you're sick of feeling torn in two, journey with me as we reunify the two lands in Middle Kingdom Egypt.
You can't talk about the rise of the Middle Kingdom without setting it within the context of the First Intermediate Period. Remember, that time was one of fragmentation and regionalization. And while it may not have been the total chaos of the Ipuwer Papyrus possibly claims, there certainly were political and military struggles. One set of kings, noted as the 10th dynasty, ruled from Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt, while a set of very powerful nomarchs began to arise in the south near Thebes. Eventually, these Theban leaders became so powerful they declared themselves kings, the new 11th dynasty, even though they just ruled over Upper Egypt in the south.
Now, the rise of Thebes started with a guy named Intef, and he started out as a local leader, but he soon proclaimed himself to be the king of Egypt and the founder of the 11th dynasty. Now, this of course was total crap. If he was a king at all, it was just of the area right around the city of Thebes. His successor, the creatively named Intef II, conquered nearby Abydos, which was important because it was the burial place of early kings, symbolically linking him with Egyptian royalty. Soon, he'd be waging war with the Heracleopolitan kings in the north.
After the short rule of Intef III, alright, enough Intefs already. Power passed to Mentuhotep II, who dealt the final blow to the Heracleopolitan kings in the north. After defeating them, Mentuhotep II reunified Upper and Lower Egypt, and he was proclaimed king of a unified land, and the very first king of the Middle Kingdom.
So Mentuhotep's reunification of Egypt happened right around 2055 BCE. And he wasted no time at all picking up where the Old Kingdom rulers left off. He exerted his power with expeditions for precious metals and minerals into the Sinai Peninsula. And he sent military campaigns into Nubia to regain southern lands Egypt had once lost over the past 100 years. He also reasserted central authority, restarting the religious cult of the pharaoh and depicting himself with the divine headdresses of Amun and Min.
Throughout the Old Kingdom, Egyptian kings were portrayed as youthful, idealized, unchanging, divine beings. And we can see in this statue of Khafre that all these elements come together. Khafre was the builder of the second pyramid at Giza, and he ruled for more than 25 years, meaning that even if he came to the throne relatively young, he left relatively old. Yet when we look at this diorite statue of King Khafre, it's as though he's preserved with eternal youth. His face and body are those of an idealized young man, and the falcon, the representation of the patron god of kingship, Horus, watches over his back, associating him with the gods.
And interestingly, it's not just this one statue. We can look at this statue of Menkaure, the builder of the third pyramid at Giza, flanked by two goddesses and exhibiting the same idealism and youth as Khafre. And this statue of Khufu, even though it's not as well preserved, and perhaps maybe of lesser quality, it still shows similar characteristics to the one seen here. And when you incorporate the texts associated with kings, like the pyramid texts, they also link kings directly to the gods. So at its core, that was the ideology. The pharaohs were gods, here on earth and for all of eternity in the afterlife.
That all began to change in the First Intermediate Period and in the Middle Kingdom. The Intermediate Period showed that kings could be challenged and that the local leaders, mere humans, could rise up and take hold of the royal reins. And despite Mentuhotep II's reinstatement of the imperial cult, the core ideology of kingship had changed.
Now, literature, as we'll see a little bit later, begins to show that bad things can indeed happen to the king, and that the king is in fact fallible. Art begins to depict kings more realistically, a little bit less like the idealized youth of the Old Kingdom, and more the way people, kind of actually looked. We can see that here with the statue head of Amenemhat III. And the kings themselves begin to portray themselves not so much as distant gods, but as leaders who take care of their people. So here, we can see Senusret I portraying himself as the shepherd of the people. Literature, too, also moves away from this purely divine realm to focus on the real world and the problems inherent in it. In something known as the Instruction of Amenemhat, the ghost of the assassinated king talks to his son about not trusting anybody, a far cry from the invincibility of kings during the Old Kingdom.
All this isn't to say that Middle Kingdom kings were weak. Since the time of Mentuhotep II, Middle Kingdom kings did all the things you'd expect successful kings to do. Wage some wars, send out foreign expeditions for resources, and construct and rebuild religious monuments. One of the distinctive Middle Kingdom royal strategies for maintaining power and consistency was to make their heir co-regent or co-ruler as they got older. This way, the older king and the younger prince could rule together for a time, ensuring that the transition of power would go smoothly once the king died.
Now, most scholars believe that the rule of Senusret III marks the highest point of the Middle Kingdom. He was so strong that he seems to have abolished nomarchs altogether. Although the tombs of local officials at that time still show that, A, they were still quite powerful and wealthy, and B, they were also devoted to Senusret III, despite losing the title of nomarch.
Senusret III became known as the most militarily powerful king of the Middle Kingdom as well. He led massive successful campaigns in the south in Nubia, modern-day Sudan, in his 6th, 8th, 10th, and 16th years of his reign. And upon his victories, he built a series of massive forts along the southern border, officially delineating Egyptian territory from unconquered territory to the south. After gaining power, he tightly controlled the access and movement of non-Egyptians, allowing them into the forts to trade, but forbidding any travel by ship north into the Egyptian homeland.
Now, Senusret III's accomplishments were memorialized more than 1,000 years later by the Greeks. He was known to them as Sesostris, and Herodotus claimed that he colonized all of Europe, while a later Greco-Roman historian said he once conquered the entire world. Now, these claims, right, they're clearly outlandish, but they do provide valuable information for how Senusret III was perceived by later generations. And they likely tell us something useful about the power he wielded during his time as pharaoh.
Every culture has their artistic and literary high points. We might think back to Shakespeare in the early 1600s, or Victorian literature, or the great Russian writers of the 19th century. For the ancient Egyptians, the literary high point was undoubtedly the Middle Kingdom. Most scholars believe that this was the time when writing itself, the hieroglyphics that represented sounds and syllables and ideas, reached their peak. But this was also the time when literary content, the texts that emerged from these hieroglyphs, started to move in new and innovative and complex ways.
Now, personally, I remember taking hieroglyphics as a class back when I was an undergrad. And sure enough, we started with Middle Egyptian. Now, these Middle Kingdom texts are interesting because of how they deal with the difficulties of real actual life. No longer is it just about how great the king is or how wonderful the gods are. Now we're grappling with real actual subjects, and the themes of these texts can resonate through the ages.
One of the most famous stories is the debate between a man and his Ba. The Ba was part of one's soul, the mobile part that would fly off like a bird between the land of the living and the land of the dead. In this story, a man is complaining to his Ba that life is simply awful, and he suggests that he might be better off just going to the West being the afterlife or the land of the dead. Now his Ba reminds him of all the wonderful things about life, and says you'll be dead soon enough. Enjoy life while you can. Unfortunately, we don't know whether the man took the Ba's advice or not. But this is a relatively deep issue for people to be writing about nearly 4,000 years ago.
In another text, known as the Eloquent Peasant, there's a poor man who's robbed by a wealthy man. And they go to court, and it turns out that the poor man is an excellent, beautiful speaker. And weirdly, the judge likes listening to this guy so much that he keeps delaying any verdict so he can just keep listening to the poor guy go on and on with his amazing speech in court. Now, eventually the man gets justice. But this is almost Kafka-esque in terms of its commentary about how far regular poor people must go in order to flatter those in power.
We saw earlier that one of the shifts during the Middle Kingdom is that kings started to be portrayed more as shepherds of their people, as opposed to aloof deified rulers. That doesn't mean that they weren't seen as gods, just that they also wanted to convey their practical contributions to helping their people. And when it comes to art in the Middle Kingdom, we get somewhat of a similar shift towards everyday life, as opposed to simply a focus on the gods and the divine.
Now, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the artifacts from the tomb of Mekhet-Ra, an official in Thebes during the later part of Mentuhotep II's reign. His tomb was filled with wooden models of daily life, like we can see here with men paddling a boat, and a peaceful garden is depicted. It's over there now. Everyone knows that the afterlife has to be filled with beer, and Mekhet-Ra has a miniature wooden model of a brewery as well. Perhaps the epitome of boring daily life. He even has a model of cattle being led out in front of a government building where officials, like himself, would levy a tax on them. So a wooden model of taxation. Talk about mundane, everyday life in the wooden objects in the tomb of Meket Ra.
The daily life in these wooden models also plays out in the reliefs and paintings of non-royal tombs. Here we're looking at the tomb of Khnum-Hotep II from Beni Hassan in the middle of Egypt. We can see Khnum-Hotep riding on a boat through the marshes hunting birds. Elsewhere, we can see Khnum-Hotep hunting animals with a bow and fishing with a harpoon. And in a nearby tomb dating to the Middle Kingdom, we can see people engaged in wrestling and boxing, some of ancient Egypt's earliest depictions of what we might consider competitive sports.
Even the pharaohs got in on it, the real-world artistic movement. When we look at the way Senusret III and Amenemhat III are depicted, it's no longer with the youthful idealism of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Instead, they're shown with lines of age and more realistic features. The work of caring for their people is starting to show embodied upon their face. So the Middle Kingdom can't boast the massive pyramids of the Old Kingdom, nor the incredible temples of the New Kingdom. But culturally, in terms of art and literature especially, we see a classical age arise. One that brings the lofty pharaohs down, at least to some extent, from their divine perch, to be real and true leaders of their people. And this movement allows people to embrace the beauty of daily life. Fishing and gardens, and of course, brewing beer. And it allows them to grapple with the difficulty that life also brings. So sometimes development isn't just about how tall your pyramid is. It's how deeply you ponder the meaning and complexities of one's own life. Just a couple lessons you can learn from